Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Scotland. Now, last week's elections across the UK threw up some interesting and contrasting results. In Scotland, the SNP were dominant. In Wales, Labour won well. And in England, well, almost all of England, Boris Johnson's Tories reigned supreme. Now, our guest on today's show has a particular interest in the political success of Boris Johnson because he's written a book about the Prime Minister called The Assault on Truth. As a former journalistic colleague, Peter Oborne is in a strong position to explain the rise and rise of Boris Johnson and his apparent ability to ride through any personal scandal to electoral success. How does Peter Oborne assess Boris Johnson's ability to walk on political water? And does he think he'll come out dry? Well, over to Alex and Peter to discuss.
Peter Oborne, in your recent book, The Assault on Truth, you pointed out that the strained relationship that Boris Johnson has with veracity. Now, just a few weeks after that damning indictment, he's cock of the walk, he's master of all he surveys, he's laid the Labour Party low in England. What is going on?
Well, first of all, I think, Alex, we have to say this is a huge political achievement in England for the British Prime Minister. I mean, Labour has been, at a moment when it really ought to be doing quite well, has done incredibly badly. What is going on in terms of the truth, the British people has made, or the English people, one should say, have made a really quite interesting decision. They have good reason to suppose that he's very sleazy in the sense that there's one inquiry after another into his personal misconduct in Downing Street and as Prime Minister. And they've decided it doesn't matter. And this is a new thing in British politics. We haven't had it in my lifetime.
But isn't there a simpler explanation if we look at the results in the Free Nations? Mark Drakeford in Wales, Nicola Sturgeon winning in Scotland, Boris Johnson winning in England. Isn't the public just commenting on the handling of, well, the vaccination programme in particular? Isn't this just a thank you to the three political leaders who've taken the country through the pandemic?
Yes, and it's not just the vaccination. There is, in times of emergency or national crisis, like the pandemic, there's a natural desire for people to look towards their leaders. And in the case of Mr. Johnson, he's considered to have done well. I don't think he did at all. I think we know that he completely failed to take account of he didn't attend the first 5 Cobra meetings on this emergency and made a total nonsense of the early stages. And but there is a general fact that in times of emergency, people vote for their leaders and like them, even if they don't deserve that support.
Isn't there perhaps a disconnect, though, between political journalism and the public attitudes? I mean, the last 2 weeks of these election campaigns, the Tory party were under great pressure because of the activities of Mr. Johnson and indeed his predecessor, Mr. Cameron, about lobbying scandals and this sort of thing. But the public don't seem to care one iota about that sort of stuff. Would that be a correct reading of the situation?
The reading which you've just described is the one which is being pumped out now by Mr. Johnson's allies in Downing Street and beyond. In other words, we have now the matter of Mr. Johnson's lying and his cheating and so on, and these his relationship with Tory donors and concerning the redecoration of Downing Street. That no longer matters. The voters have spoken. And I think it is true to the extent that, we've heard voters speak. They think there are other matters on the doorstep, COVID. But on the other hand, that is not a reason not to interrogate. In fact, that's our duty, not to interrogate what Mr. how he spends his money in Downing Street, who's giving him money or loaning him money. This is all proper questions for journalists to ask. It isn't a Westminster bubble issue.
Is there not some sort of disconnect between what journalists and newspapers believe to be important and what the general public vote on as important?
That's a very profound question, because it is true that most journalists, politicians, policymakers, in general, civil servants tend to live in the great metropolises, whereas voters are scattered everywhere, and they have a different perspective. But on the other hand, I think that the average voter may discover that Mr. Johnson has been lying to them, and that Brexit hasn't been this wonderful economic triumph which he tends to project. And there's going to become a moment when reality and the world created by Johnson, which he projects very effectively, particularly in northern areas, are going to part company. And people are already seeing in sort of port areas like Kent that the Brexit promises are costing them jobs, destroying their businesses. So we are living in a sort of fantasy world in many ways at the moment. How long that will persist, I don't know.
Now, Peter Ober, you've been noted for your command of sweeping views of politics. One of the most influential thoughts in early 20th century political developments in England was the strange death of liberal England, as it was called. Can you explain now the strange death of the Labour Party in northern England? What on earth is going on?
The book you refer to there, George Dangerfield's Strange Death of Liberal England, suggested that Britain was heading to some form of revolution in 1914, and they only escaped from this revolution by everybody traipsing off to the great tragedy of World War I. And there was going to be a working class revolution. Labour Party suffragettes were causing mayhem. And I forget what the third leg of Dr. James. I do recommend the book. Wonderful read. The Strange Death of the Labour Party. Brexit has been the problem for the Labour Party. And so if you look at Hartlepool, which was a safe Labour seat, the voters first of all, they voted Brexit. Many of them were Labour, and then they've all gone almost unanimously to the Conservatives. That's the immediate problem. The longer problem, I think, is Tony Blair. Mr. Blair became Prime Minister, advised by that political genius, Peter Mandelson, in 1997. And the basic strategy was that you completely ignored your base voters, the working class. You devoted your strategy to appealing to a relatively small number of middle-class folk who would swing the election in your direction. And that's what Tony Blair did very successfully. But in the medium term, the effect of this was to betray the working class, betray your core vote. And many of those voters felt despised. And for the time being, they've ended up with Mr. Johnson's Conservative Party. They've abandoned Labour. And that is not something you can blame on Keir Starmer or Jeremy Corbyn or Ed Miliband. That is a direct result of the very cynical strategy adopted by Tony Blair.
And now that Mr. Johnson has emerged triumphant over the Labour Party in much of England, is he now going to turn his sights to the last redoubt of Labourism in Wales? And what about in Scotland, where the independents and the SNP are resurgent? How is Mr. Johnson going to deal with these upstarts in the Celtic nations?
You keep on asking really difficult questions, but and it's probably too difficult to be certain, but it feels like Mr. Johnson, by mistake in some ways, has ended up leading a sort of English nationalist movement. And to that being the case, he is the biggest possible gift you would have to the independence movements in Wales and indeed in Scotland. The way he talks about the union, the awesome foursome, is flippant. It doesn't, I'm a strong unionist, but it's flippant. It doesn't pay proper respect, I think, to the historic nature of the union and what it means, and is full of clever ideas, and he doesn't have a proper sense of what the union is.
So would you draw a contrast then between the unionism of, let's say, David Cameron and the unionism of Boris Johnson?
Yes, I think that David Cameron, for all of his faults, had a genuine commitment, enormous commitment and belief to the union. Boris Johnson is a more opportunistic politician. I'll give you one example. It involves Ireland, actually, not Scotland. It's Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, structured her deal because she realised that she couldn't do any damage to the Good Friday Agreement. And she really respected the nature of the union in Northern Ireland. Boris Johnson smashed that deal of Mrs. May's. And the reason he did that was opportunistically, I think, in order to dismantle her leadership. She did have a respect for the union, which you can see Johnson didn't in that sense.
So would you say that Boris Johnson has a personal culpability for the instability that we see now in Northern Ireland? And is there any awareness in Downing Street that he might bear that responsibility?
There's no sense. This is another thing which makes Johnson unusual not unknown, but unusual among modern British prime ministers. There's no sense of shame and really no sense of responsibility. He's a brilliant user of language, but he uses it for one tactical short-term end after another. And when events don't turn out as he predicted or said they would, he's moving along so fast. The train is moving at such a clattering pace that everybody forgets the promises and pledges and decisions he made. At the moment, he is the master of all he surveys. This is a brilliant political technique. He's the most powerful prime minister since Tony Blair on the eve of the Iraq War. He has a sort of dominance. One thing which we haven't mentioned is the press, which have played the British media, which has played a major role in cementing this situation and projecting Mr. Johnson's aura and not questioning his lies and not exposing his cronyism and sleaze. But that is, at the moment, you cannot, it is prodigious. He's as powerful as Maggie Thatcher in 1987. Remember, after that great victory, or Blair after 2001.
Join us after the break, where Alex continues his discussion with top journalist Peter Oborne. We'll see you then. Welcome back to the show, where Alex continues his discussion with Peter Oborne.
So let's reflect more generally, Peter Oborne. Can you identify the sort of techniques that you've found so offensive, the outright lies, the manipulation of the media? Is that something new in politics, or is it just something that's got modern techniques to make it all the more pernicious?
Politics has been invested by very rich men who have bought the political parties and have started to control, to use politics as a form of investment and getting, for selfish, greedy reasons, to get contracts, to get rewards in the House of Lords, to get honours. And so politics has been captured by greed. That's associated, I think, with the rise of neoliberalism, but it's not the same thing. George Osborne made this remarkable statement shortly after he and David Cameron, that little modernising faction, gained control of the Conservative Party in 2005. Osborne said, I didn't know how easy it would be to take over the Conservative Party, as if it was him taking over. He'd become Chancellor, he hadn't taken over. And that sense of honour and service had just vanished with that remark. And the modernisers attracted these rather unscrupulous backers who were in politics in order to, in some cases, pursue their ideological agendas. In other cases, just to make money, to win contracts, which we're seeing now. There's an enormous number of Tory donors who are being given contracts.
But Peter O'Byrne, you talk as if this is a new development. If we go back to the days of Monday Gregory, who was busy selling honours and peerages for Lloyd George and Stanley Baldwin, and was convicted of it. That was way back in the 1920s. So what is different now compared to then?
I'll tell you one difference. I'm not going to name any contemporary names, you'll be relieved to know, for legal reasons, but he was convicted of it. It goes on today, left, right and centre. And nobody even raises an eyebrow. And more generally, I think that if you look at the standards of integrity, which prevailed post-World War II in particular, when the cabinet secretary was a formidable figure and the process, the civil service process was very strong, that you really can't point to many instances of corruption, and those that there were punished, like Poulsen, for instance, the property development case, or Profumo, who lied to Parliament and then resigned and went into charity work. There was a much higher code of public honour, and the political parties were not in the hands of very rich men the way they are now. The rise of the party donor has been one of the most malign features of modern public life.
Now, in the Assault on Truth, you meticulously detail the occasions where the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been at variance with the actuality. But is this really, again, something that started with Boris Johnson? I mean, weren't you similarly critical of Tony Blair's spin doctor, Alistair Campbell? I mean, isn't this just a continuation of a trend as opposed to something which is particularly Johnson-esque?
You make a very good point about Tony Blair, and I did write a book about Mr. Blair and his entourage, and nothing is going to ever be as terrible as the lie about weapons of mass destruction, which was used to justify an illegal war. It should be said that Mr. Blair denies to this day that he was lying about that. He would say, misinformed by the intelligence services. I think that's what he says. But after the Blair episode, under Gordon Brown and David Cameron, Theresa May, you didn't get this kind of lying. There was a pathology under Blair. And Johnson is a different thing altogether. He just fabricates all the time. It's very like Trump in that way, almost with relish and enjoyment. You know, there's lots of examples of making things up for the fun of it. And I think this is a new scale of public lying, and I think that has a real problem here because it can last for so long. But at the end of the day, it will become obvious to everybody that there is a large gap. I mean, an incredible gap between truth and reality. But of course,
one of your bête noirs was Dominic Cummings, the erstwhile controller of spin and manipulation in Downing Street. Now, there's been a huge parting of the ways between Mr. Cummings and Mr. Johnson. And indeed, it was generally thought Mr. Cummings was busy sticking the knife in before the elections. Does the election results settle Mr. Cummings' hash as well?
Yeah, this is a very interesting point that you raise, because Mr. Cummings has been blamed not least by Mr. Johnson himself, who went to the lengths of ringing up newspaper editors a few weeks ago and saying that the source of these stories about him, about his wallpaper and that sort of thing, was Mr. Cummings. And of course, now that he's had this election triumph, Mr. Johnson's allies will now say, oh, that wallpaper thing, or the latest episode, the Standards inquiry announced a day into his holiday in Mustique, oh, that's that man Cummings. He's embittered. Don't pay attention to him. And that is a way of trying to divert attention from the fact that the integrity of the Prime Minister is, unless I'm being terribly old-fashioned, a matter of real importance. It doesn't matter who says these things. The matter is, did he do them? You're quite right. There's going to be a real attempt to say to British journalists and to the world at large that somehow Mr. Johnson has been handed a pink ticket by the elections.
Now, you're a former colleague of the Prime Minister. Indeed, were highly complimentary about his skills as a journalist, so you know him better than most. Now, is Boris Johnson the sort of man who goes home to Downing Street and has a good laugh about the day's events, or is he someone who pores over what might be in the social media or the next day's headlines? Is he a worrier or is he devil-may-care?
On the basis of the Johnson I knew at The Spectator when I worked for him as I was his political correspondent and he was the editor, he won't care a damn. I mean, that is one of the great redeeming features of the Prime Minister, is that he wasn't over-consumed by sort of personal vendettas or, you know, whatever was written about him in the papers, or he would go back home and be very good company. I mean, that is the Johnson I know. Now, whether that is still the case in Downing Street, I couldn't possibly say, because I regret to inform you I haven't had an invitation.
Now, you surprised me greatly. Now, I'm going to ask you, Peter Oborne, as a convinced unionist, to do something which is very out of character. I want you to give some advice to Nicola Sturgeon, who has had a similar substantial election victory in Scotland, and as she sizes up Boris Johnson and wonders how to take him on the issue of the constitutional future of Scotland, what advice would you give to Miss Sturgeon?
Well, Miss Sturgeon has got a very natural course of action, which is to undermine Boris Johnson by pointing out the very arguments he used for Brexit are the arguments which, of course, undermine his own unionist case. And the second thing which she has in her armoury is that Mr. Johnson's, and this is something which does disturb me as a unionist, is that Mr. Johnson's well-documented record of lying, not least about the SNP, means that whatever he says in a putative referendum campaign carries zero weight.
So let's move more generally again, Peter Oborne. Do you see a turning point in politics? I mean, you've well described your disillusionment with some of these techniques that have crept into politics, how the parties have become under ownership of their big donors, how that is a malign development across politics. Do you think there's going to be a turning point that people eventually say, no, we're fed up with this, we're going to elect a clean government party, or do you think we're on a road to perdition?
To answer your question, you have to understand what has happened to the Conservative Party. It's changed from being a pragmatic, sensible, the party you knew when you were an MP, you know, broadly based party, to being something which is quite very right wing. It's moved in towards the alt-right, to use the jargon term, just as the Republicans have done in the United States. And it's dedicated to waging a series of culture wars. Economically, it's shifted dramatically, of course, to the left. And it reminds me very much of Orban in Hungary, who's a clientelistic political leader, which is to say he identifies supporters and rewards them, and then uses something very approaching hate speech to marginalize minorities. It's quite a frightening new form of politics. We haven't had it in Britain ever. And the question is, what is going to stand up against it? And that is the problem which Keir Starmer has, because I think Keir Starmer is quite a decent man, but so far everything he's done suggests he's a very poor politician. And if you can form a broadly based party which does stand up for decency and does deliver on its promises, that will be a very important thing. But at the moment, Mr. Johnson's unique brand of conservatism, and I wouldn't even call it conservatism, because for me, the Conservative Party was about due process and about being scrupulous and honest. Mr. Johnson's conservatism is temporarily dominant. It won't be dominant forever. Nothing ever is.
And finally then, Peter O'Byrne, where is the opposition going to come from? Is it going to come from the opposition parties at Westminster? Is it going to come from a revived press perhaps through the social media? Is it going to come from the civic society? Is it going to come from the Celtic nations? I mean, who is finally going to say enough is enough? We're putting a stop to this.
Well, I'm a unionist, so I hope that the Celtic nations aren't too successful in their opposition. I do think at some point there's going to be a break between Mr. Johnson's two constituencies, because he has the traditional Tory heartlands, which are the pragmatic, middle-of-the-road, relatively low-tax people of the home counties and the shires and parts of London. And at the same time, he's got the new constituency, which is the former Labour voting working class, which wants massive public spending and quite likes Mr. Johnson's brand of exhibitionism. And can those two parts of the coalition remain together? Obviously not. And also the other point, of course, is that Mr. Johnson is never going to be able to rescue Hartlepool he might be, all the Hartlepools there are in Britain. He just isn't. It isn't possible.
Peter O'Byrne, thank you so much for being such an insightful and entertaining guest on the Alex Salmond Show.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Alex.
Peter O'Byrne has provided a powerful critique of the techniques of modern government and indeed of Boris Johnson's government in particular. However, the Prime Minister's continued electoral success provides a salutary reminder that the political scandal that often fascinates the mainstream media is no substitute for the long-term trends which dominate at the ballot box. At some point, realistic and serious opposition to Johnson will emerge. Will it be from a revived opposition at Westminster? Will it be from the Celtic nations? Will it be from the online media? Will it be from civic society? But nature abhors a political vacuum. That opposition will emerge, and when it does, the Johnson train may well hit the buffers. And so for now, from Tasmina and myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now. Keep staying safe, and we'll see you again next week.